we need to move and have Attorney Brendan Shiller is going to come up and give us some recommendations as well. He actually practices dealing with civil rights law and criminal defense. So we think he has some really interesting things that he wants to share with us, and we'll come back and we'll do the next two bills after Attorney Shiller is done. Went to law school with him, guys. You don't want to know the stories that I know about Shiller.
Thank you, Melissa. I actually have some very specific proposals for the panel, but before I get there, I want to say a little bit about me, and then I want to say a little bit about what I don't think we need to worry about. I built a 10-attorney law firm. We're a private firm, but we figured out a way to make money while serving the people. So about 30% of our practice is criminal defense. About 30% of our practice is what's called civil rights, but mostly means suing the police. About 30% of our practice is immigration, and about 10% of our practice represents small businesses. We just bought a 13,000 square foot building on the west side that we've been rehabbing, and we're opening in the summer there by California and Harrison.
Who's your mother?
And my mother's former Alderman Helen Shiller. I also represent some medical marijuana interests. So that's kind of where I come by this. We have on average about 150 criminal cases we defend every year. We have an average about 50 civil rights cases we pursue every year. And this is throughout the county, throughout the Northern District of Illinois. So that's the basis by which I'm going to come to these specific proposals in a minute. Before I get to the specific proposals, I want to talk about a couple things, because I think it's always necessary at these events, about what we need to know about today's current youth, because there's some misnomers that come out of this. As we sit here today, today's generation of teenagers, today's generation of youth, are the least self-destructive, the least destructive, and the most educated youth since we've been keeping good records. And really, we've only been keeping good records on all of this for about 60 years in this country. They're less likely to commit any acts of violence than any generation for the last 60 years. They're less likely to be self-destructive and commit suicide than any generation for the last 60 years. They're less likely to engage in abusive drug use, and there's a slight distinction, but abusive drug use than any generation for the last 60 years. And it's a myth. It's an unfortunate, nostalgic-induced myth that this generation is somehow worse than our generation or their generation or our mother's generation or our grandparents' generation. The fact of the matter is they're better. These are far better people, these young people. And we need to keep that in mind when we talk about what needs to be done. Okay. So I have some specific proposals. One very specific proposal for the state. There's a state statute, 725 ILCS 5/103-3. That's the state law that says you have a right to a phone call, a reasonable number of phone calls in a reasonable amount of time when you're arrested. Anybody who's familiar with the history of injustice when it comes to the criminal justice system in the city of Chicago knows that the reason Burge was able to get false confessions, the reason Guevara was able to get false identifications is because people were held in custody for 1 day, 2 days, 3 days without any phone calls. It doesn't matter what the state statute says. Who determines reasonableness? The police department. And what's the remedy if it's violated? There is none. There's a simple way to rectify that. Reasonableness needs to be defined. Anything more than 2 hours is unreasonable. Anything more than 2 hours is unreasonable. If your family doesn't know where you're at, if your attorney doesn't know where you're at, if you've been disappeared within the police department, this isn't Chile circa 1973, that's unreasonable. But that can be defined in the state statute with a simple amendment. Anything more than 2 hours is unreasonable. And there can be a remedy if that gets violated. A simple remedy. A remedy that says, if this is violated, you have an administrative right, you get attorney's fees, and it can be very similar to the federal statute that relates to false credit reporting. You get a $500 damage award if you are held for more than 2 hours without getting a phone call. And we know that in the city of Chicago, one of my other roles is I'm on the advisory board of the First Defense. We know that in the city of Chicago in 2013, less than 0.3% of all arrestees had an attorney visit, because obviously they necessarily didn't have access to attorneys, but there's free attorneys all over the place. It's called First Defense for arrestees. They didn't get their phone calls. And when you don't get your phone calls, unfortunately, bad things happen at the police station. So that's something that's I think very simple, state fix. I got a more complicated county fix, Commissioner Boykin. So we know that police accountability is one issue. We also know that youth jobs are another issue, despite the fact that this is I would consider best generation of teenagers, of youth. We also know there is a very direct correlation between access to jobs or lack of access to jobs and crime committed by youth. And it's very hard because, you know, we've been in a 35, 40-year austerity, both on federal and state in terms of money for youth. But I think there's a way to incentivize the private sector. I think, you know, Commissioner Gaynor put together a very interesting plan for a land bank a few years ago. I think the county can pass a law that says banks that are lien holders on property that's been vacant for more than 30 days have an obligation to board up that property, but that they will get a credit from the county for boarding it up if they use youth from the state district or the county commission district to actually do the board up. Now, you got a 14th Amendment issue. You can't do it around race, but you can do it around districts. You can even do it around wards. And you can incentivize those banks to hire young people in the private sector to do the board up of those vacant buildings on the south and west side that remain vacant, and that we always put the onus on the owner instead of the lien holder, which is the banks who have the money to make it happen. So I think in terms of the county, that would be my suggestion, my very specific suggestion for the county. And I don't want to take up any more time. I got other suggestions. I'll email you, but I got one other suggestion. I got one other thing I want to talk about, and this is back to the state. So I think, let me just say this. I think police accountability, jobs, mental health, which I haven't had the time to talk about, but I know everybody agrees that's a big issue. I think the next issue is guns. The problem is with guns, every time we talk about guns, the resulting legislation is, again, more onerous legislation that somehow criminalizes our youth and results in higher penalties and more Black and Latino youth going to prison for a longer time as they're targeted. We need a creative piece of gun legislation. We know that the federal government tracks every serial number on every gun. We know that the city local agencies, when they seize guns, are supposed to call into leads and give that serial number. What nobody is doing is doing an analysis and seeing if a large proportion or a disproportionate amount of those guns are coming from particular retailers. And I would suggest to you that they're straw buyers, but if you have a straw buyer going to the same retailers regularly, and those retailers recognize that this same straw buyer is buying 1,000 guns, 2,000 guns, 3,000 guns, that you can criminalize that conduct. And that if you really want to have gun laws, you take away the focus from the gun possession. You take away the focus from the young Black or Latino man who has the gun, and you put it on the people who are putting the guns into the market, into the stream. You put it on the gun retailers who are hiding their head while straw buyers come to them. And I think there's a way to criminalize that. I know there's a lot of other speakers here today, and I got a direct line. It's Melissa, so I'm going to send her my other recommendations to her. But I want to thank you very much for the opportunity to bring these recommendations to you today, and thank you very much.